comrades, awaken. For far too long, the very essence of your existence, the labor of your hands, the sweat of your brow, the hours of your life has been reduced to a mere commodity bought and sold in the cold, unfeeling market of capitalist profit. You live, and yet you do not live fully. You labor, and yet you are enslaved by the invisible chains of wages and markets. The system tells you that your value is measured not by your humanity, but by the profit you generate for the few who own the instruments of production. This is not destiny, it is theft. It is the theft of your time, your dignity, and your very self. Do not be deceived by the illusions of individual success or the false promise of social mobility. These are but opiates, designed to distract you from the truth, the few who sit atop the economic hierarchy grow fat from your labor, while you are left to scramble for mere survival. Capitalism thrives on division. It tells you that your struggle is your own, that your poverty, your exhaustion, your anxiety is the result of personal failure, rather than the systematic exploitation that underpins this society. But this is a lie. The misery you endure is the product of a system that extracts your labor to enrich the few while rendering you powerless. Understand this, comrades. The value of your labor, the very act of your work, is the source of all wealth. Without your toil, the factories would fall silent, the fields would lie barren, and the wealth of the world would vanish. Yet, the fruits of your labor are stolen from you, transformed into commodities to fatten the coffers of the bourgeoisie. You produce life, yet you are forced to live a life dictated by the rhythms of profit, as if your existence itself were a mere resource to be bought and sold. This is not natural. It is not inevitable. It is the deliberate design of a class society that thrives on inequality and depends upon your ignorance and disunity. The true power lies not in the capitalist gold, nor in the mechanisms of the state, nor in the markets that enslave you, but in your collective labor, in your solidarity, in your awakening consciousness as a class. When workers recognize their shared plight and unite, the foundations of the system tremble. Rise, then, comrades, and refuse to accept the commodification of your life. Refuse to be measured by the market's cold calculation. Reclaim your hours, your energy, your mind, and your spirit from the clutches of profit. Organize within your workplaces, your communities, your neighborhoods. Educate each other, share knowledge, build networks of resistance that no market can dissolve. Your strength lies in your unity, your weapon is your labor, collectively wielded, consciously directed, unbound by the chains imposed by capitalist exploitation. Understand that this is not merely a struggle for fair wages or better conditions. It is a struggle for your very humanity. To fight for your rights as workers is to fight for the restoration of your dignity. To demand control over your life is to demand the overthrow of the structures that commodify existence itself. Every hour you labor without full awareness, every life lived in silent submission, is a reinforcement of the system that profits from your subjugation. Break this cycle, comrades. Act with clarity, with courage, with the knowledge that together you are invincible. Do not fear the rhetoric of those who claim revolution is dangerous or utopian. The true danger is in acquiescence, in accepting that your life has a price tag. The true utopia is the emancipation of labor, the liberation of humanity from the chains of capital, and the construction of a society in which the fruits of your work belong to you, in which your life is your own. This is not an abstraction, it is a possibility, a responsibility, a historical imperative. Comrades, hear the truth. The market will never honor your dignity. The system will never grant you freedom. These must be seized, claimed by your own collective will. Rise, organize, and act. The life stolen from you can be reclaimed. The chains that bind you can be broken. The humanity that capitalism suppresses can flourish once more. Let the few tremble, for the many have awakened, and history belongs to the workers. Comrades, consider the very nature of your existence under the capitalist system. From the moment you rise in the morning to the moment you rest your weary body at night, every heartbeat, every motion, every moment of your time is appropriated, measured, and calculated in terms of profit. The system tells you, subtly yet relentlessly, that your value is not inherent in your capacity to think, to love, to create, or to live fully, but in the quantity of labor you can expend and the wealth that your labor can generate for the owners of capital. Your body, your mind, your energy, your creativity, everything that makes you human is transformed into a commodity to be bought, sold, and exploited. The market does not see you as a living being. It sees only labor power, a resource to extract, a cost to minimize, and a product to monetize. You are taught to accept this as natural, as inevitable. The advertisements, the culture, the institutions all work to normalize this theft of life. They whisper that success is the accumulation of wealth, that dignity comes from consumption, and that your labor is a mere stepping stone in the pursuit of material goods. Yet, what they fail to tell you is that the very wealth you are told to aspire to is created by your labor and systematically taken from you. The commodities you produce, the services you render, the innovation you create, all of this enriches the few who hold control over the factories, the banks, and the machinery of production, while you are left to survive on a fraction of the value you generate. This is not a misfortune. It is the essence of capitalism. The system relies on your labor being alienated from you. Your work is not your own. When you labor, you do not labor for the fulfillment of your needs or the expression of your talents. You labor to produce something that exists outside of you, something that serves another's profit, something that you cannot fully claim as your own. The factory, the office, the farm, the service desk, all are instruments of this alienation. The product of your effort, instead of sustaining your life, is sold on the market to feed the coffers of the bourgeoisie. Your hands build wealth for others, while you struggle to meet your own needs. The time you spend in toil is not yours. It is expropriated, measured, quantified, and sold as if your very life were a currency. Consider, comrades, the implications of this reality. Every hour spent in work that does not satisfy your human needs, every task performed under the pressures of profit rather than purpose, diminishes your freedom, your capacity to think freely, to create, to cultivate relationships, to engage with the world as a conscious human being is constrained. You are forced to live in a system where your existence is subordinated to the imperatives of accumulation. The clock, the wage, the quarterly profit report, these dictate your life more than your own desires or choices. You exist not as a human being, but as labor power in the marketplace. And the marketplace does not recognize your humanity, it recognizes only your utility. This commodification of life is systemic, deliberate, and profound. It penetrates every aspect of society. Education is oriented toward producing workers for the market rather than thinkers for humanity. Culture is shaped to valorize wealth and consumption rather than human flourishing. Even relationships and personal aspirations are measured against the yardstick of economic success. You are encouraged to compete, to envy, to conform, to accept scarcity and inequality as natural conditions, all while the system extracts the fruit of your labor. The capitalist society thrives not only on exploitation, but on the ideological control of those who are exploited. It convinces you to see your life as a commodity, to judge yourself by productivity, to measure your worth in terms of economic output rather than intrinsic human value. But, comrades, the truth is undeniable. Your life is not a commodity. Your labor is not a tool to be owned by others. The wealth of the world is created by your collective effort, by the sweat of your brow, by the skill and energy you contribute. Without your labor, production grinds to a halt, commerce ceases, and the empire of capital collapses. It is not the capitalists, the bankers, or the merchants who generate wealth. It is you, the workers, the creators, the living beings who make the world function. Yet under capitalism, this fundamental fact is inverted. The system convinces you that the few who appropriate your labor are the true creators, while you who generate all value are merely cogs, replaceable and insignificant. To reclaim your humanity, you must first recognize the lie. You must understand the mechanisms by which your life has been commodified and by which your labor has been alienated. You must see the system not as a collection of neutral institutions, but as a class structure designed to appropriate your time, your energy, and your creativity for the benefit of others. Awareness is the first step toward liberation, for only when the workers see the chains that bind them can they begin the work of breaking them. Your labor is the source of all wealth. Your life is the source of all meaning and these cannot be owned by another without your consent. It is not enough to seek small reforms, temporary relief, or incremental improvement. The transformation must be total. The recognition that your life is not a commodity must translate into collective action, into the organization of workers, into solidarity that transcends the divisions imposed by the system. When labor is united, when the consciousness of the exploited awakens, the entire structure of capitalist exploitation becomes vulnerable. The market may dominate appearances, but the reality is that without labor, the market is nothing. The commodity is meaningless without the human labor that produces it. Therefore, comrades, rise from the illusion of commodified existence. Understand that your labor, your time, your creativity, your very life belongs to you and not to the system. Reject the notion that your worth can be measured in dollars or manipulated by markets. Your value is inherent in your humanity, in your capacity to think, to create, to love, and to struggle. Recognize the theft that has been perpetrated against you and awaken to the power that lies dormant within collective labor. The life that capitalism seeks to commodify is yours to reclaim, and the liberation of labor is the liberation of humanity itself. Comrades, open your eyes to the reality that surrounds you, the struggles you face, the exhaustion you endure, the insecurity that gnaws at your existence. These are not the result of personal failure, laziness, or incompetence. They are not accidents, nor are they the punishment of fate. They are the inevitable consequence of a system structured to exploit, to dominate, and to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a few. The suffering of the working class is not an anomaly, it is the design of the capitalist order. Every wage you receive, every hour you toil, every drop of your labor is framed by this system, which depends upon the extraction of value from the many for the enrichment of the few. Capitalism presents a world of apparent choice, of meritocracy, and of individual opportunity. But these are illusions carefully constructed to obscure the mechanisms of exploitation. The system tells you that if you fail to thrive, it is because you lack effort, intelligence, or ambition. Yet, the truth is far more structural. The opportunities you are offered, the conditions under which you labor, the very framework of your daily life, are shaped to benefit the ruling class. The architecture of society, the ownership of factories, the distribution of resources, the laws, the institutions is designed to ensure that those who control capital maintain their dominance, while the workers are confined to role that extract their labor but deny them the full fruits of their efforts. Consider the factory, the office, the fields, the service sectors. In every sphere of work, labor is organized not for the fulfillment of human needs, but for the accumulation of profit. Your energy is measured in output, your time is measured in wages, and your value is determined by the surplus you generate beyond what you are compensated for. This is the essence of systemic exploitation. It is not a personal slight or the result of bad intention, but a fundamental relationship between classes, built into the very structure of economic production. The capitalist does not merely profit from your labor. The system requires your labor to be alienated, to exist as something separate from yourself, something that can be appropriated, quantified, and converted into profit. Every moment of suffering, every condition of insecurity, every instant of overwork or underpayment is embedded in this class structure. Poverty is not a reflection of moral weakness, it is the product of the deliberate distribution of resources, where wealth is concentrated in the hands of those who control the means of production. The stress, the exhaustion, the anxiety you feel is not a reflection of personal inadequacy, it is the mechanism by which the capitalist system maintains control. By keeping the working class overextended, underpaid, and divided, the system ensures that its exploitation goes largely unchallenged. The competition that is constantly promoted among workers, who is more skilled, who is more productive, who can earn more, is not a natural human condition, but a strategy to prevent collective consciousness from forming, to prevent the recognition of shared oppression, and to keep the workers fragmented and manageable. Understand this clearly, comrades. Systemic exploitation is not abstract. It manifests in concrete, measurable ways. The disparity between the laborer and the capitalist, between the worker and the owner, is not accidental. It is codified in wages, in working hours, in access to education, healthcare, in political influence, and in the cultural norms that glorify accumulation and stigmatize poverty. Your suffering is a necessary product of the system, not a moral failing of those who labor. Every wage gap, every precarious job, every health crisis that disproportionately affects workers is a reflection of structural inequality. The capitalist does not need to intend harm for the system to exploit. The system itself produces harm as a natural consequence of the economic relations it enforces. This understanding must shift the way we perceive our struggles. No longer can you blame yourself or your neighbors for the hardships you endure. No longer can you be misled into thinking that individual effort alone can overcome structural oppression. The reality is that exploitation is woven into the fabric of society, maintained by the ownership of capital and the control of production. To address suffering as personal misfortune is to be complicit in your own exploitation. To see it as systemic is to recognize the possibility of collective resistance, to see the mechanisms of power and the avenues through which change can be achieved. The systemic nature of exploitation also reveals the solution. It is not reform alone, nor personal improvement, but collective organization and class consciousness. Only when workers understand that their suffering is shared, that their labor is the source of all wealth, and that the structure of society is designed to extract and appropriate their efforts, can they unite to challenge the system. The laws, the institutions, and the cultural norms that uphold capitalism are not immutable. They are human creations. And like all human creation, they can be dismantled, transformed, and replaced by structures that serve the needs of the many rather than the profit of the few. Comrades, the realization that exploitation is systemic is not merely intellectual, it is revolutionary. It illuminates the pathways of resistance, the strategies for organizing, and the necessity of solidarity. When you comprehend that your struggles are shared, that your oppression is rooted in class relations, you begin to see that your liberation lies not in isolated effort, but in collective action. The capitalist system thrives on division, on the belief that workers are alone, that their suffering is personal, that their hardships are deserved. Once this illusion is shattered, the workers can recognize their true power. It is the unity of labor, the collective awareness of systemic exploitation, and the conscious application of collective force that can challenge and ultimately overthrow the structures that perpetuate suffering. To recognize that exploitation is systemic is to reject self-blame, to reject the moralization of poverty, and to reject the notion that suffering is inevitable. It is to see clearly the relationship between classes, the mechanisms of extraction, and the strategies of control. It is to understand that your labor, your effort, your life is not an individual problem, it is a social and economic product of a system designed to extract your value and consolidate power in the hands of a few. Once this truth is known, action becomes necessary, solidarity becomes essential, and the struggle for liberation becomes both inevitable and righteous. Comrades, the most dangerous force in existence is not the machinery of the state, nor the armies of the capitalists, nor the laws that protect the wealth of the few. The most dangerous force, the force capable of overturning the entire structure of exploitation, is the conscious unity of the workers. When the laboring masses awaken to the truth of their shared condition, when they recognize that the oppression they endure is not an individual failing but a systematic design, when they see that the wealth of the world flows from their toil yet is hoarded by the few, then a power arises that no capitalist calculation, no market manipulation, no political decree can contain. Collective consciousness is not merely awareness, it is the ignition of action, the formation of strategy, and the materialization of revolutionary potential. Consider the way capitalism operates. It thrives on division. It seeks to fragment, isolate, and categorize workers so that their strength remains dispersed. It teaches you to compete, to envy, to mistrust, to see your fellow laborers as rivals rather than allies. It convinces you that your personal advancement is paramount, that solidarity is optional, that your neighbor's struggle is separate from your own. These divisions are not accidental, they are essential. The capitalist knows that a disunited working class is powerless. A single worker, no matter how skilled, no matter how diligent, is easily replaced, easily contained, easily dominated. But when workers perceive their common exploitation, when the veil of isolation is torn away, the illusions of hierarchy crumble, and the real relations of power are revealed. The recognition of shared oppression transforms the individual into a participant in collective destiny. It is not enough to understand that exploitation exists. Comprehension must lead to unity. The worker who grasps the system alone is aware but powerless, like a flame flickering in the darkness. The worker who joins with others in conscious solidarity becomes a blaze capable of consuming the structures of domination. The unity of labor is not merely moral, it is strategic. When workers unite, the very foundation of capitalist production becomes threatened, for the system depends upon the control and compliance of its laborers. Take away that compliance, and the mechanisms of exploitation falter. Factories cease to operate, supply chains halt, services collapse, wealth accumulation slows, and the illusions of inevitability begin to shatter. Comrades, history teaches us this truth repeatedly. The revolutions of the past, the strikes, the uprisings, the organized movements, all succeeded not because a single worker acted alone, but because collective consciousness emerged, because solidarity was recognized, and because labor organized as a conscious class. The bourgeoisie fears this power above all else. It fears not the lone agitator, but the masses acting in conscious unison. It invests immense resources in education, propaganda, policing, and surveillance to suppress this awakening, to convince workers that their interests are separate, to fragment solidarity, and to maintain the illusion that the existing order is natural and unchangeable. This fear is a recognition of the truth. Collective consciousness is the true weapon of the oppressed. When workers recognize their shared plight, the scope of their power expands beyond the individual workplace. Unity allows for coordination across industries, across regions, even across nations. The labor of one is strengthened by the labor of many. The struggle of one becomes the struggle of all. A strike is not merely a refusal to work, it is a declaration that labor will no longer be exploited, that wealth cannot flow from your toil without your consent, that the workers collectively hold the keys to production. A movement built on consciousness recognizes that the chains that bind one also bind all, and the liberation of one is inseparable from the liberation of all. The capitalist system relies upon invisibility and ignorance. It hides the reality that the workers themselves create all wealth. It teaches you to accept authority, to obey schedules, to follow rules, to endure without question. But consciousness pierces this veil. When the workers understand that they are the producers of everything society values, that the capitalists exist only because labor has created the conditions for their dominance, the legitimacy of that dominance evaporates. The system is shown to be not natural, not inevitable, not ordained by logic or divinity, but a construct hierarchy sustained by the lack of collective awareness among those who create value. Unity is the revelation that the emperor has no clothes, that the foundation of power are built on the labor of the many and the submission of the masses. But consciousness is not static. It must be nurtured, shared, and acted upon. It grows through education, discussion, organization, and direct experience. Workers must see beyond the immediate confines of their individual struggles, beyond the illusion of isolated suffering, and recognize patterns of oppression, exploitation, and control. They must connect their experience with the larger class structure, see their workplace struggles as part of a systemic problem, and understand that only through joint action can meaningful change occur. This is the essence of collective power, not merely the awareness of oppression, but the conscious alignment of purpose, the strategic coordination of effort, and the mobilization of numbers in pursuit of justice. Comrades, the capitalist fears this awakening precisely because it is unstoppable once it reaches critical mass. A unified, conscious working class can challenge wage slavery, fight for equitable distribution, demand control over the means of production, and ultimately dismantle the structures of oppression entirely. Markets, profits, and property become meaningless when labor withdraws its consent. Laws, armies, and police forces lose their power when collective solidarity is unbroken. The consciousness of workers, when organized, becomes the lever capable of lifting the world from the hands of the exploiters. Therefore, comrades, awaken not only for your own sake but for the sake of all. Recognize that your struggle is not solitary. Understand that your liberation is inseparable from the unity of your fellow workers. Solidarity is not an abstraction, it is the materialization of revolutionary power. The awakening of consciousness, the recognition of shared oppression, the deliberate act of unity, these are the forces that shake the foundations of capitalist control. It is through this unity that the working class can move from submission to mastery, from exploitation to emancipation, from alienation to self-determination. Comrades, to speak of humanities, not to speak of abstractions, ideals, or lofty dreams, it is to speak of what has been stolen from you, what has been suppressed, and what must be wrested back through conscious struggle. Under capitalism, your labor, your time, your very existence has been subordinated to the demands of profit. You have been trained to accept alienation as natural, to measure your worth by what you produce. For others, to yield your creative and intellectual powers in exchange for mere survival. To reclaim your humanity is to reject this arrangement, to assert that life, in its fullness, belongs to those who live it, and to act upon that truth with deliberate, sustained effort. Awareness alone is insufficient. To recognize exploitation and the commodification of existence is an important first step, yet without action, awareness risks becoming inert, a quiet resignation to suffering rather than a spark of revolution. Humanity cannot be reclaimed passively. It is not granted by the state, the law, or the markets. It must be actively taken, seized from the hands of those who would profit from its suppression. This reclamation demands the organization of the working class. For individual effort alone is powerless against the structural apparatus of capitalism. Alone, a single laborer is a voice lost in the cacophony of the system. United, the workers become a chorus that cannot be ignored, a force capable of demanding justice, altering conditions, and reshaping the social order. Organizing is the foundation of all action. It is not enough to grumble quietly, to harbor indignation in private, or to dream of liberation without uniting with others who share your struggle. The capitalist system has meticulously constructed barriers to prevent solidarity. It encourages competition, fosters suspicion, and imposes hierarchies that divide the workers from one another. These barriers are not coincidental. They are central to the perpetuation of exploitation. Therefore, the first act of reclaiming humanity is to break these divisions, to reach across industries, communities, and neighborhoods, to forge bonds rooted in shared purpose and mutual support. Organization transforms fragmented discontent into coordinated action, allowing the collective power of labor to challenge the structures that oppress it. Education is equally essential in this struggle. The capitalist system relies not only on material control, but on ideological domination. From the earliest stages of life, you are taught to internalize inequality, to accept hierarchy, to revere property, and to see submission as a virtue. The culture of capitalism masks exploitation as opportunity, alienation as freedom, and oppression as natural law. To reclaim your humanity, you must see through these illusions. Education is not merely the accumulation of facts. It is the cultivation of understanding, the development of critical consciousness, the capacity to analyze and interpret the social, economic, and political structures that shape your life. By educating yourselves and others, workers pierce the veil of ideology, recognize the systemic nature of exploitation, and arm themselves with the intellectual tools necessary for meaningful resistance. Resistance is the expression of humanity in action. To resist is to refuse the passive acceptance of commodification, to challenge the imposition of alienation, to assert the sovereignty of life over profit. Resistance takes many forms: strikes, collective bargaining, mutual aid, public demonstration, political mobilization, and the creation of alternative social structures that prioritize human needs over capital accumulation. Each act of resistance, no matter how small, disrupts the machinery of exploitation and affirms the humanity that the system seeks to suppress. Resistance is not reactionary, it is proactive. It is the conscious decision to reclaim control over your life, your labor, and your future. The intertwining of organization, education, and resistance forms the trinity of action required to restore humanity. Organization provides strength, Education provides clarity, and resistance provides expression. Without any one of these elements, the effort falters. A well-educated working class without organization is scattered, organized workers. Without understanding are directionless. Resistance without preparation is futile. The workers must act collectively, deliberately, and knowledgeably, understanding that their liberation is inseparable from their capacity to wield their labor and consciousness as instruments of change. Consider the world around you, comrades. Every injustice you endure, every instance of poverty, exploitation, or inequality is a call to action. It is not merely a moral failure of society, it is a structural inevitability. Under capitalism, and therefore it demands structural response. The clock that measures your working hours, the wages that undervalue your effort, the markets that consume the fruit of your labor, all are instruments of oppression that can be challenged through collective, informed action. By organizing, educating, and resisting, you confront these instruments directly, undermining the structures that reduce human life to a commodity and asserting that existence, creativity, and dignity cannot be subjected to the dictates of profit. This struggle requires courage, for the system will resist with all the tools at its disposal. Threats, coercion, propaganda, and economic pressure will attempt to intimidate and divide you. Yet, the reclamation of humanity demands persistence. Each act of solidarity, each shared lesson, each demonstration of resistance chips away at the power of the oppressors and strengthens the consciousness of the working class. The effort is not merely for survival, it is for the restoration of what has been taken, for the right to live fully, to create freely, and to determine the course of society through collective will. Comrades, remember that reclaiming humanity is not an abstract ideal, it is a practical necessity. It is the recognition that life cannot be quantified, that labor is not a commodity, that your value is not measured in wages but in your capacity to think, feel, and act as a conscious being. Through the disciplined efforts of organization, the illumination of education, and the courage of resistance, the working class asserts its agency, confronts systemic oppression, and lays the foundation for a society in which human life is no longer subordinated to profit. This action is the embodiment of humanity, the reclaiming of self, and the first step toward a world where labor serves life rather than life serving labor. Comrades, understand this truth clearly. Freedom is not granted by those who profit from your labor. Dignity is not bestowed by the systems that alienate you, and control over your work cannot be purchased or petitioned from the hands of the ruling class. These are not privileges to be begged for or rewards to be earned through compliance. They are inherent rights of all human beings, stolen from you by a system designed to extract your labor, diminish your agency, and concentrate wealth in the hands of a few. Liberation, then, is not an act of negotiation or reform. It is revolutionary. It requires the decisive action of the collective, the awakening of class consciousness, and the assertion of the working class as the rightful masters of the wealth they produce. Consider the nature of your current existence under capitalism. Every hour you labor, every skill you apply, every effort you expend is appropriated by others. The products of your mind and body are turned into commodities, sold for profit, and alienated from your control. The wages you receive are but a fraction of the value you create, and your very life is subordinated to the rhythm of production schedules and market imperatives. To live under such conditions is to live half a life, to experience alienation in both body and mind, and to accept the degradation of humanity as inevitable. The capitalist system pretends that this arrangement is natural, that hierarchy is ordained, and that your labor exists to serve others. Yet this is false, comrades. The laborer creates all value, and it is only through collective seizure of this value that true freedom and dignity can be realized. Revolutionary liberation begins with the recognition of this truth. To awaken is to see that freedom cannot exist as long as the few control the many, that dignity cannot flourish in a society where work is expropriated, and that control over labor is impossible when production is subordinated to profit rather than human needs. It is to understand that every reform offered within the existing framework, higher wages, limited protections, or token concessions cannot achieve the fundamental emancipation of labor. The system is structured to perpetuate exploitation, and only by challenging the system at its foundation can the working class secure its rights. Revolution is not a violent indulgence or an abstract ideal, it is the necessary response to a society in which the majority is denied its due. Collective action is the only pathway to such liberation. Individual effort, no matter how noble or diligent, is insufficient. A single worker may resist exploitation for a time, but isolated resistance is easily neutralized by the power of the state, the market, and capital. It is the collective, acting in concert with understanding and determination, that possesses the capacity to alter the balance of power. When workers unite to assert control over production, when they refuse to allow their labor to be alienated, when they organize to seize the wealth they produce, the system trembles. The market, the factories, the financial institutions, all depend upon the compliance of the many. Withdraw that compliance collectively, and the structure of exploitation begins to collapse. Dignity, comrades, is inseparable from this collective struggle. To be dignified is to live as a conscious agent, not as a tool for another's enrichment. Under capitalism, your labor is stripped of its dignity, your creativity, your effort, your skill are subordinated to the demands of profit. To reclaim dignity, workers must collectively assert the primacy of human need over profit, the value of life over the value of money, and the sovereignty of those who produce over those who appropriate. It is not a solitary achievement. Dignity is reinforced and sustained through solidarity. When workers see themselves as part of a collective, when they recognize that their struggle is shared, and when they act in unity, dignity is no longer a fragile, individual possession, but a collective force that challenges exploitation and affirms humanity. Control over labor is the third pillar of revolutionary liberation. Labor is not merely a commodity to be rented out for wages, it is the source of all wealth, the foundation of society, and the means by which humans transform the world. Yet under capitalism, labor is controlled by those who do not perform it direct to serve profit rather than need, and alienated from the worker who produces it. True liberation requires the collective seizure of this control, the ownership of production by the workers, the decision-making power over how and what to produce, and the equitable distribution of the fruits of labor. Without such control, freedom is illusory, dignity is conditional, and humanity remains subordinate to the imperatives of the market. The revolutionary process is both strategic and moral. It is strategic in that it requires planning, organization, education, and the careful coordination of collective action to overcome the entrenched power of the capitalist class. It is moral in that it asserts the fundamental principle that human life, labor, and creativity cannot be subordinated to profit without violating the very essence of existence. Revolution is the conscious act of reclaiming what is rightfully yours, the ability to live freely, the right to exist with dignity, and the authority to determine the conditions under which labor occurs. Comrades, history confirms this truth. Every meaningful liberation, every workers' movement, every social revolution, every successful strike has emerged not from individual heroism, but from the collective power of organized labor. When workers act together with awareness and purpose, they can dismantle the structures of oppression, redistribute power, and create conditions in which freedom, dignity, and control are no longer privileges of the few but rights of the many. This is not a distant dream. It is the material potential inherent in the laboring class, waiting to be realized through unity, struggle, and revolutionary action. Therefore, comrades, embrace the revolutionary imperative. Recognize that your freedom, your dignity, and your control over labor cannot be granted, they must be seized. Recognize that these rights are inseparable from the collective, and that only through unified, conscious, and deliberate action can the working class transform exploitation into emancipation, alienation into ownership, and oppression into the realization of humanity. To fight for these principles is to act, not only for oneself, but for all. to assert the primacy of life over profit, and to lay the foundation for a society in which labour serves life rather than life serving the imperatives of capital. Comrades, hear this clearly: the chain that bind your labour, the oppression that strips your dignity, and the systems that commodify your very existence will not be lifted by hope, by compromise, or by the goodwill of those who profit from your toil. Liberation is not given, it is seized. Humanity cannot be reclaimed passively. It demands struggle, unity, and conscious action. The power to overturn exploitation, to assert your rights, to live freely and with dignity, lies not in the hands of the few, but in the collective strength of the many. Every hour of labor, every ounce of effort, every shared act of resistance is a step toward reclaiming what has been stolen. Organization transforms discontent into force. Education transforms awareness into strategy. Resistance transforms courage into victory. Together, these are the weapons with which the working class can challenge the structures of domination, dismantle the machinery of profit, and assert control over the world they create. Comrades, remember, your labor produces all wealth, your unity threatens all oppression, and your collective consciousness is the spark that can ignite a revolution. The market cannot define your value, the state cannot grant your freedom, and the capitalist cannot dictate your life. Only you, together, acting with understanding and resolve, can reclaim your humanity. Rise, organize, educate, resist, and seize the world that is rightfully yours, for history belongs not to those who exploit, but to those who labor, unite, and fight for justice.